All right. So, hi, everyone. My name is Jack Corelli. I am the Director of Government Relations for the Planetary Society. I'm based here in Washington, D.C., where I help run the Space Policy and Advocacy program with these two great colleagues of mine that we have on screen now. So, Casey,
Yeah.
who are you? What do you do for the Planetary
I'm I,
Society?
I'm the Chief of Space Policy here at the Planetary Society. Obviously, a lot of you know me and my colleague Jack. Been working quite a bit this year on the Save NASA Science campaign, and over the last many years, really pushing for space science as part of the increased federal investment. We do have. I'm excited to, I guess, join us this briefing, a new face who will be joining us for the next year at least. Ari, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Yes, thank you, Casey. So, if you've attended these last few briefings that Casey and Jack have put on, you'll have noticed that it was just the two of them, and I am now a new face here with you all, helping with operations here in DC. I'm a policy and advocacy fellow with the Planetary Society for the next year, and I came to the organization through the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship Program, which is now partnering with nonprofits. And I come from an academic background of planetary science. I have a PhD in astronomy and planetary science from Northern Arizona University. And I'm excited to be putting my energy towards this cause at this time. And so, as with Jack and Casey, if you have any questions at any point, you can feel free to reach out to me as well, as I am now a presence in DC, working towards advocating for space science with Jack. So with that, I'll let these guys take it away with the presentation, and I'll be monitoring in the background with the Q&A towards the end.
Thank you, Ari. And remind me, how many days have you been on the job?
This is my third day in the
Yeah.
office.
Third day and already taking a leadership role
We'll
here
save
at the
all the hard
Planetary
questions for
Society.
Ari today. See how he
This
does.
is his trial by fire, we'll say. Great. Let me start our slideshow and everyone can see this screen, right? All right, Casey, can you confirm you can see this?
Yes.
Great. Great. So if you've attended any of our previous briefings, this is some of this will seem pretty familiar with to you. So we're going to go over a handful of topics today, but really, as Casey said, want to focus a lot of our energy on the questions y'all might have about NASA's budget and the direction it might go in the next few weeks as we careen towards the end of the fiscal year on September 30th, which I checked my calendar yesterday is less than 14 days away. So really a fast pace, though I think maybe day by day is the same, it's 24 hours and some change, but seems like it's coming much quicker. So as I said, I'm Jack Corelli, the Director of Government Relations, joined by Casey and Ari to talk about this. So love to give, for those not familiar with the Planetary Society, though if you aren't, why aren't you? We're an independent public interest member organization. I'll say based in Pasadena, though none of us three panelists are based in Pasadena, California. Me and Ari are in DC and Casey up in Washington State. So we have the Washingtons covered for sure, but we have a global network of more than 2 million space enthusiasts that help support our mission of empowering the world's citizens to advance space science and exploration. We were founded in 1980 by our three co-founders, Lou Friedman, Bruce Murray, and Carl Sagan. Very interesting time period as it right now as it is reminiscent of sort of the original reason that we were founded, to represent that public enthusiasm for space that was not being matched by government funding priorities. Early 1980s was a very bad time for space science. And we crawled out of that and became the world's leading space science nation with NASA's space science program. And we're facing a tumultuous time right now, but I'm sure as we get through this, we will have another golden era, I hope, of space science and exploration. fun fact about us, we accept no government contracts or contributions from commercial, academic, professional organizations. We are entirely people powered. And so that means we can have a independent view when it comes to matters of public policy. We work very closely with our friends in commercial space, in the academic spaces, but us, the Planetary Society, get to represent a more independent view. Casey, anything you want to add on to that? Great. So here's our three co-founders in front of, I think, our original Planetary Society headquarters. Here's a little bit about what we do. We provide data and analysis. We write articles. We provide useful data sets. We go to the Hill. We go to the Hill. We go to the Hill. Ari and I have been there, I think, every day that you've at least been on board. And we are that public voice for space science and exploration here in Washington and around the globe. We have members in almost every country, but certainly every continent. And yes, that does include Antarctica. So our goals for our training today, so we want to share the latest information about the fiscal year 2026 budget situation that's facing NASA, discuss the consequences of a continuing resolution that is currently, I think, being debated in either the Rules Committee or on the floor of the House, and sort of understand that role and process of Congress, right? This can be a very confusing thing for people not steeped in public policy. It can be very confusing for the people that are steeped in public policy. And then also, yeah, like I said, we want to make sure we're answering all of your questions. So, Casey, you want me to take this or? Cool. So let's talk about NASA's budget. So looking at all of US federal spending, you have about $6.8 trillion annually spent by the US federal government. NASA is but a small portion of that, about 0.37% of all federal expenditures. If you were to break all of the federal government's annual expenditures into units of NASA, you would have, of course, one NASA and 287 non-NASAs, right? That is an incredible scale, right? Looking at the federal government. So NASA is not this huge 5, 10, 15% of federal expenditures. It's actually less than 0.5%. And space science is 1/3 of that annual expenditure. Visualized another way, you obviously have your mandatory spending, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, which are dealt with those big reconciliation budget bills like we had earlier this summer. Discretionary is that annual budgeting process that we talk about, right? When we talk about the NASA budget, we're talking about the discretionary, a portion of the discretionary budget. That is not even the majority of all federal spending. Most of federal spending comes from those mandatory programs. And NASA is but a subset of a subset of a subset of what's called non-defense discretionary. So not Department of Defense and not a mandatory expenditure. It is something that is discretionary, something that the Congress chooses to do every year. NASA is broken up into a number of different fields. Science, the thing that we're going to talk a lot about today, has historically been about 30% of NASA's annual expenditure. Deep space exploration systems, or exploration, is currently, we call that the Artemis program. Space operations is the International Space Station. Space technology is technology maturation programs. Facilities, IT, and salaries, I think, are self-explanatory, and as is aeronautics. So let's dispel a big myth that we've seen come up over the summer is, a lot of people were talking about the HR1 big beautiful bill, had a million different names it felt like over the summer, but this Budget Reconciliation Act is not the annual budget. It actually deals primarily with that mandatory spending element, not the annual spending of the federal government. And so a lot of people are talking about a budget bill passing this summer. They're talking about this HR1, this Budget Reconciliation Act, not the annual budget process. So let's talk about that annual budget for NASA. So back in May, which feels like an eon ago, but back at the end of May, the Office of Management and Budget, the organization in charge of drawing up the plans for the budget every year. And they send what's called the President's Budget Request to NASA. And they say, hey, or to Congress, and they say, hey, here's how much we want to spend on all of these different priorities. These are expansive documents. They can range from 400 to 700 pages in length for NASA alone, let alone every other agency gets their own what they call congressional justification that goes through line by line and tells you exactly what the administration wants to do with that, $1.8 trillion that's part of that discretionary budget. The budget that came out for NASA earlier this year was, I guess, for lack of a better term, terrible. And something we want to talk about here is the three words that we've been using to describe this: unprecedented, unstrategic, and wasteful. Wasteful of the taxpayer's investment. So what do we mean by this? So for unprecedented, this was the largest ever proposed decrease in NASA's budget history, dating all the way back to pre-Apollo era. I mean, even when we were ramping down Apollo, the proposed cuts to NASA's budget don't even rival what was proposed in what's called the President's Budget Request, the PBR. This 24% cut would basically bring us down to funding similar to what we had in 1961, fiscal year 1961, which began in calendar year 1960, before Alan Shepard went to space, right? Before human spaceflight began as an endeavor. That's the budget level that this request would put us at. In terms of the cuts to science gets targeted with a 47% decrease, which again would be the largest decrease in science in a long time for NASA. I guess early 1980s, there was another proposal to do a very similar thing and gut this space science program at NASA. So this would bring NASA's annual expenditure for science down to the lowest point since 1984. Again, as I said earlier, 1980 is not seen as a very high watermark for space science endeavors in the US. Here's what your tax dollars go towards, right, for us in the US. These are all the missions that are in development or operation across all of the 5 science divisions at NASA. So NASA breaks their divisions up by general scientific disciplines. You have heliophysics in yellow, that's study of the sun. Earth science, I think pretty self-explanatory in green. Astrophysics, looking at the furthest objects and dark matter, dark energy, that's in blue. Planetary science in purple, which is the exploration of planets in our solar system. And biological and physical sciences, which is primarily research instruments on the International Space Station, but looking at human health and effects in space. If enacted, the president's budget request would see these missions disappear. They want them to go away overnight, right? And this is all because of that 47% cut to the Science Mission Directorate budget. And it hits all of the divisions, not equally, but equally seriously. It would cause all those great missions to go away because there just would not be the funding to support them. There are also major changes to human exploration, which I know is a top priority for the Congress and for folks in the broader space exploration community or space community. Artemis, a lot of debate can be had over the architecture for Artemis, but by and large, this is a program that has survived a presidential transit, I guess I'll call it 2 presidential transitions, from the first Trump administration to the Biden administration, and now from the Biden administration into the second Trump administration. And so that doesn't happen. Casey, when was the last time that a moon program survived a presidential transition?
That would have been arguably, barely, Johnson and Nixon in 1969-70, or 68-70, 69. So it's a very rare thing, or a return to the moon program, never, right? So it's a hard-won consensus and speaks quite kindly to the strategic political structure of Artemis as established during the first Trump administration.
Yep. And you see programs like Gateway canceled, missions beyond Artemis 4 canceled in the budget proposal, all replaced with a very vague, well, we'll just ask commercial industry to do it. Meanwhile, commercial industry is wondering, well, who's telling them that we have these capabilities, that these are just readily available on the market, right? This is sort of a mismatch of policy ambitions with the policy reality that we're in. And included throughout the document is this very fun line that I know many congressional appropriator loves to read, which is, we'll let you know what we're going to use the money for. You should just give it to us and trust. That does not build a lot of confidence between a new administration and the Congress, regardless of party control. So by unstrategic, what do we mean? So we're looking at massive layoffs, proposed layoffs at every NASA field center. This is just civil servant reductions. This doesn't even count the probably tens of thousands of contractors that go to support all of these jobs. NASA itself, I think at its most recent peak, maybe in the last 3 or 4 years, was capping out about 18,000 people. Right. It's not a huge agency in the grand scheme of the federal government, which is about 2.4 million people are civil servants. For NASA, for every one civil servant job, the rule of thumb is about 16 contractor jobs go to support that. And that's folks in industry, in staffing agencies, in the various roles needed to accomplish NASA's mission. Seeing those cuts enacted, and maybe we should have a chart that's updated with what we do know about the people that have left the agency, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. If enacted, these cuts to NASA's workforce would bring us to the lowest workforce in real numbers. This is just number of people working at the space agency, would bring us down to pre-human spaceflight levels, to fiscal year 1960 or calendar year 1959. So it's definitely come from this cut first mentality. They had a budget goal and they worked backwards from that, which is historically not how budgeting works in this country. Typically, it's an additive process justifying, that's why it's called a congressional justification, justifying what we're spending the taxpayers' hard-earned money on, who give it to us in the form of taxes, to provide services to the benefit of the American public. And this is not the approach that they took this year. Very much was we want to cut NASA by $6 billion. We have to figure out how that's going to work. I'd also say specifically undermines the president's stated space policy goals. This is a president that in the first term was truly a tremendous change in space policy trajectory. Really, I think, changed the game when it comes to space policy. We saw a lot of major advancements in the policy realm that then had tangible benefits in the technical and scientific realms. And even in the inaugural address and first joint address to Congress, the president mentions space exploration and specifically Mars exploration as a top priority. Yet the budget itself, coming from a little-known group called the Office of Management and Budget, undermines those goals entirely by cutting a lot of the key programs that go to support them. It breaks alliances with partnerships, and we've been saying surrenders the solar system to other nations because it truly does. Now, I do want to just take a moment. This is not the president's budget. This is not Congress's budget. This isn't even Secretary Sean Duffy's, who's serving as the acting administrator of NASA. This is Russ Vought's budget, right? This is the director of the Office of Management and Budget, what I've been calling him dollar store Lex Luthor. He is somebody that historically has not seen a lot of value in space science, is not a space geek like some of us are, right? This is someone who does not believe that the government should be investing in space exploration or space science. And we know that because just a couple of years ago, very much wrote this exact thing that he wants to propose a 50% reduction to NASA science should he be the Office of Management and Budget Director. And so this is a lineage we can trace back to just a fundamental misalignment in terms of priorities between even the president and his OMB director when it comes to space science. Finally, wasteful. We turn off 19 spacecraft that your tax dollars went to fund, right? That are currently flying, that are producing data, that have survived tremendous technical hurdles, but also a little thing called senior review, which is the process by which NASA reviews on a regular basis long-term missions to make sure they are going to continue to be of value to the taxpayer. And it terminates 19 of these missions, in addition to another 21 or 22 missions that are in development across the Science Mission Directorate. And all that accounts to about $12 billion in taxpayer-funded investment that they would propose shutting off overnight. That are currently operating something like OSIRIS APEX, which is the U.S.'s only mission going to rendezvous with the Apophis asteroid coming in 2029 to do a reconnaissance flyby. The only missions to Venus that the U.S. has would be terminated as part of this. It's not part of that 12 billion, but another set of missions that would be proposed for cancellation, as well as another 39 missions beyond that. Casey, anything you'd like to add here?
That $12 billion is conservative estimate. That's the life cycle cost at launch, so not adjusted for inflation. So it's rebuilding these would cost a lot more than that. And as many of you know, the amount of time to design build these are unique assets. They're not coming off a conveyor belt. Would be decades, and then of course travel time to places like New Horizons beyond in the Kuiper Belt right now. If you launch a new one tomorrow, it takes 20 years to get where it is right now. So these are once these are gone, these are gone.
Yeah, you can't get them back. And Congress agrees with us with these three words: unprecedented, unstrategic, and wasteful. Congress has pretty uniformly this summer produced two budget proposals, one in the House, one in the Senate, that fully fund NASA. So the actual body of government, the branch of government that writes the budget, that writes the laws, says this is unacceptable, and have actually written legislation that keeps NASA fully funded at the top line level. The House does include some small cuts to science and some other parts of the agency. But the Senate proposal basically keeps everything fully funded from the currently enacted years. So let's talk a little bit about the state of play. So again, talking about that big, beautiful bill, HR 1, Budget Reconciliation Act. There was an amendment to that offered by Senator Cruz of Texas, who chairs the Commerce Committee, which oversees NASA's activities. Included in that, so I said earlier, it's not the annual budget. Well, it's not the annual budget. It looks on much longer timescales, but you can include riders, right? Pieces of the legislation that support key programs in specific years and provides what we'll call supplemental funding to the annual appropriation. So this doesn't take away from an annual appropriation. This is money on top of what's already going to be allocated on an annual basis. And so I won't go through it line by line, but here are just some of the programs that Senator Cruz's amendment to the budget reconciliation bill fund over the next 4 years.
It's worth maybe dwelling on this for a moment because I think this had a lot of understandable confusion over the last few months about what this meant. And this is distinct from annual appropriations. And let's just emphasize this a bit. It's distinct from annual appropriations in the sense that this money has been provided, past tense, it's been signed into law. It has availability, unlike annual appropriations, for the next 7 or so years, has directions on how and when it will be spent. So it's a $10 billion lump sum that will be doled out over the next few years, mainly in the next 5 years, to be spent ultimately, obligated and contracted over the next few years, spent by, I think, 2033 or 2032. 2032. And again, pretty much exclusively for legacy human spaceflight or pre-existing human spaceflight programs, part of Artemis. I think it goes to show the strength of that Artemis political coalition, that this came through that process. But also quite a rapid rebuke, I think, to the proposals in the president's budget request, and goes to one of our core ideas here of unstrategic, in that they didn't secure support from their own party in the administration for this rather radical change, not just for obviously science, but for human spaceflight. And at the same time, we have seen initial op-eds coming out from not Cruz, but from Brian Babin, who's the chair of the House Science Committee, Republican from Texas, saying that the OMB, again, Russ Vogt, is not actually being clear or being eager to spend this money. So the problem with the OMB is not just that they can, in a sense, they control the flow of money, they control the rate of spending, in addition to preparing these budget requests. And so even if you provide them the money, they can throw a decent number of internal bureaucratic hurdles or slow walk the pace at which this goes out. And this is clearly creating a frustration that has been bubbling up to a higher level and public level, even among members of their own party.
Yeah. And we see that just recently, right? As you mentioned, the op-ed from Congressman Babin or Chairman Babin. And also a letter from Chairman Cruz and Babin congratulating Secretary Duffy on his new role as NASA administrator, but then basically turning around in 2 sentences later being like, hey, you guys owe us a spending plan. We don't know where you're spending the money this year. And we gave you $10 billion to allocate, including some money in fiscal year 25. So, right, a rebuke by the incumbents party.
Jack, why don't we take a few questions on the big beautiful bill, because it is, I think, again, a confusing, is covered in a confusing way, and it's impactful and relevant to this. And we have a few of them coming in. I see someone, just a basic one, repeat what Ted Cruz's role is here. He's the chair of the House Commerce Committee, which has oversight authority over NASA, among other agencies, and is generally responsible for writing the NASA authorization bill. And in that role of chair, the chair of the various committees in the House got to amend this big, beautiful bill, so to speak. I see people raising hands. Please go ahead and just submit your questions as in the Q&A. I think would be much more, given the number of people here, it'd be much easier to manage. Jack, do you see any other questions that we should address quickly on the big, beautiful bill if people have them?
There's a good one in here. How can the $10 billion from HR 1 not allow OMB to reduce the already minimal spending that we showed? So I think the answer to that one is the $10 billion is supplemental. And there are provisions in the HR 1 that became law, the Big Beautiful Bill Act, I think is what it's called now, that make clear that this is supplemental and not to be confused with annual appropriations from the discretionary account. And so this 10 billion isn't to offset or to reduce anything in the annual appropriation, but is rather that supplemental on top of it to come from the Treasury to support specific activities.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a very unusual thing. NASA normally does not have this, right? It's kind of an outside lump of money, and again, being directed of how to spend it. But again, it's making those obligations, contracts to spend the money. That is the ultimate. That needs to happen in order for the money to ultimately flow out.
Right.
Someone asked, how is there no money for science in this? That's a great question. I'll speak a little bit about the broader, I think, dynamics at play here. And then, Jack, I know you have something you want to add about the Mars Telecom Orbiter. I've been doing some work on this, and I hope to publish this in the next few months after the maybe after the fiscal year, we get through this part. But there's been a really notable divergence and concentration within NASA, almost purely by a historical accident, of its major internal directorates and responsibilities, where human spaceflight, NASA centers, have become very solidly Republican represented, at least at the state level. And NASA science centers have become very Democratic represented at the state level. Ironically, it was basically the inverse of that when NASA was established in the mid 20th century. And as that's happened, and it's not just that they've been, that may have been that way for a while in some cases, but the degree of conservative to liberal separation ideology is increasing over time, right? So if you measure it using the kind of classic DW nominate scores, the degree of difference between the representation of human NASA spaceflight centers and science centers have diverged even larger. And so given add to that the dynamics of this BBB, no Democrat was going to vote for it. They were working through a process in the Senate that didn't require a filibuster majority, so they could pass it simply with a Republican majority in the Senate, simple majority in the House. And that meant that there was no incentive, knowing in advance that no Democrat was going to vote for it, there was no incentive to add, in a sense, political enticements for parochial interests, which this very much is, for the science centers. I wish there was a larger embrace of science at this level. But I think seen purely as a parochial representational interest, you can see that kind of in the sense that they're doling out infrastructure upgrades to all the NASA human spaceflight centers in addition to these larger programs. So I think those combinations of factors really drove the fact that this was a human spaceflight thing, mainly as a way to drive certain interests within a Republican coalition based on, and again, this parochial, so again, historical accident of which programs impact which states.
Yeah. And the thing I'll just add on about Mars Telecommunications Orbiter, it does include a mention of the top priority of the Planetary Science Decadal Survey, which is the decadal every 10-year planning document for the planetary science community, which is the Mars Sample Return Campaign, which has been on ice for about 2 years. But the inclusion of Mars Telecommunications Orbiter, which is not a part of that architecture officially, but mentions telecommunications as a key infrastructure upgrade needed to do sample return, whether that is, in the next 5 years or any time in the future. It has a pretty quick timeline for providing that telecommunications orbiter. I did see a couple questions I want to try to run through as quickly as possible. If OMB is able to ignore current appropriations, why wouldn't they ignore whatever's in the CR? They're not. As far as we can tell, there's no smoking gun of impoundment. They have threatened. They have just issued their first of what people feared to be many pocket rescissions, which would allow them to not spend money. But it was the one that the Congress is considering right now is a very small package compared to what I think people were fearing. And so OMB has not explicitly attempted impoundment or ignoring appropriation law. They're being very slow to implement things like HR1 and this additional $10 billion. But they are not flagrantly ignoring the law.
That's a good clarification too. I should emphasize that. It's frustration with the pace. And again, I've been going through very detailed numbers of outlay data, even for missions that are proposed to be canceled in the coming year. And, the data that is published lags a couple of months, but we're again seeing no smoking guns, and that funding is not being reported to be going out the door. So it's all seems to be working as it should, but that doesn't mean there aren't challenges with it, right? And again, the pace and the amount of internal bureaucracy and paperwork has certainly gone up.
Yeah. And then I think maybe they're going to combine a couple questions. I do apologize. I was maybe a little confusing in how I was describing the missions at risk of termination. They are not currently canceled. Everybody is maintaining course, operating business as normal. Obviously concerned about that October 1st beginning of the new fiscal year, because we need to have a budget then to continue operations of the government writ large. But none of those 19 flight projects that are currently operating have been canceled. And in addition to those 19, there are 22 missions in development. And so I was throwing a lot of numbers out there. There are 41 missions total, 19 in flight, 22 in development.
Roughly a third of NASA's portfolio right now.
Of the science fleet.
Someone adds a clarification here saying that the telecom orbiter comes with very specific procurement direction. That means restrictions on who can get the money, which is true. Basically, only to companies that had applied to a Mars sample return study and had proposed, interestingly enough, an independent telecom orbiter as part of their architecture plan, which I think reduces the number down to 2 potential recipients, maybe a handful more. But also they emphasize as not being funded by SMD, a Science Mission Directorate. So it may be in, it implies a Mars sample return-ish project, in the writ large, but it's definitely a far cry from Mars sample return as the science project that is currently proposed to be canceled by the administration. So it's certainly not a great solution to it either.
Hey, while you guys are clarifying what has actually happened so far, it's worth bringing up this one question regarding where have the workforce reductions at NASA centers come from? What is the source of that?
That is a very good question, and one that we will get to in some upcoming slides. So, Casey, anything on that? Sorry, did I cut you off?
I just want to make sure we've got all the BBB thing just to wrap that up, because we do want to move forward, but it is, again, so confusing that I think it is worth just making sure we get to some of the questions.
Yep. I do see one. Does supplemental really mean something? Absolutely.
Yes.
It is a very key distinction. Mandatory spending is a key distinction. Discretionary is a key distinction, and supplemental. Those are kind of your 3 types of government spending.
Yeah. And to emphasize, this amendment passed. This is in the law that was signed on July 4th. This is law. And so And someone also asked if we go through and Congress does restore funding through these appropriations that you're highlighting below, Jack, would this still count? Yes, it would be on top of this. So there's an ironic potential future here where after facing its largest cut ever as percentage of percentage size, NASA could end up with one of the largest percentage increases if you add up that $10 billion on top of it. Of course, it's all functionally human spaceflight, but again, that's to be resolved. But yes, that this is on top of whatever happens with appropriations. This is in law. It's happening. It's illegal in a sense for the White House not to spend this money on these programs.
So what you're looking at here are the baseline funding. What we are, as I mentioned earlier, we don't yet have a full year spend plan for fiscal year 2025, which we're still in. So, but was funded through what's called a continuing resolution, basically taking previously enacted funding and continuing that through a set deadline. That deadline is the same as the upcoming end of the fiscal year, September 30th. So fiscal year 25 nominally is the same in terms of NASA spending levels as fiscal year 24. So that's why we have that baseline level to show you what is currently enacted. The Office of Management and Budget's request, which is a $6 billion cut to NASA, primarily coming out of things like space technology and science, with pretty small increase to human space flight. Next to that, you have the House proposal and the Senate proposal, which we'll dig into in just a little bit. Both of those, as you can see, that top line number pretty similar, and actually a slight increase in both cases over that currently enacted level. Some of the numbers within that top line are a little bit different. As you can see, the House version does bump up exploration, but roughly similar to what is currently enacted, which I would consider this a pretty strong rejection of that requested level, right? Really the short stack right there. So again, looking at that OMB proposal, I'm going to say status rejected. Congress has said this is not what we want. This is not something that is a priority, that does not represent the priorities of the U.S. Congress or the American people. Again, those three keywords: unprecedented, unstrategic, and wasteful.
Yeah, I think this is actually rather extraordinary. If you just go back to that briefly, Jack, that this goes to the strategic aspect of this, right? That, I mean, we'll emphasize this was not sold to Congress. There was no full court press by the administration to pitch this idea. Certainly not to the American public. And this goes to show, I think, that the source of this is not the outcome of a considered policy process, but a factional and potentially even somewhat personal image for what NASA should or shouldn't be expressing itself. And so it can certainly cause a lot of disruption, and we don't want to minimize that, right? And we've already kind of implied that even if the money is appropriated back to the 24 levels, NASA will still not, this won't go away. And there's still a lot of potential disruptions, both on missions and workforce, that can happen. But as a concept, to end these programs, to shift the focus to these various other initiatives, and to fundamentally reduce the amount of resources available to the space program, to be rejected pretty much out of hand by both House and Senate, run by members of the president's own party, is rather extraordinary, I think, in the course of things.
Absolutely. So this rejected. Throw that out. Let's take a look at the House and Senate budgets. So both the House and Senate budget have been passed out of their respective appropriations committees. It's important to know NASA exists in what's called the Commerce, Justice, Science, or CJS subcommittee. You'll hear us refer to it as that TLA, that three-letter acronym, throughout the rest of this briefing. So the House budget, the CJS House budget that includes NASA, passed out of full committee actually just last week. It does, however, include a 18% cut to currently enacted levels for the Science Mission Directorate. I will say the fact that we are saying that this is like a better case scenario than 47% is kind of a weird shift of the Overton window. But I will say within that within that Science Mission Directorate allocation, Planetary science and astrophysics are largely fully funded at currently enacted levels if you compare, what available information there is. And the cuts largely fall on earth science and heliophysics. There's a number of missions called out that were specifically canceled in the president's budget request, as well as a few others that weren't called out as canceled, but we're going to see either downturns in funding or are in a critical stage of development. And some of those are Juno, Osiris, Apex, New Horizons, Chandra, Mars Sample Return, all threatened to be canceled. Then you got Dragonfly and Neo Surveyor, which are currently on track, but in a critical stage of development. LISA, the gravitational wave, space-based gravitational wave observatory, also was threatened with cancellation, but is fully funded in the House version. I will say part of the amendment, part of passing this out of committee, a number of amendments were made to it. Not a lot of them specifically about NASA, but one of the ones that was indicated that the administration shall spend no less than what we tell you to on the science divisions. And so although there's that 18% cut, there is at least the surety that when they allocate that money, the administration is by law then told you have to spend that money as we tell you to, and not do any funny budget games as I know folks are worrying about. And so despite that 18% cut, that no less than language is absolutely critical. In the Senate proposal, you see is a lot closer to currently enacted, where you have science sitting at that full $7.3 billion. Basically, everything stays relatively consistent with currently enacted FY24 or 25 levels. It does keep a good balance between the scientific divisions, between those five, basically fully funding all of them as you compare it to currently enacted, and includes specific support for Da Vinci, Veritas, Hubble, Nancy Grace Roman, Habitable Worlds, the Uranus Orbiter and Probe, MAVEN, on top of other ones that the House version also included. Both of the versions also say, hey, NASA, you need to start thinking towards the future and start planning for a regular cadence of new missions across all of the scientific divisions. And so again, this is which that is called out as not a future case in the president's budget, where it says basically don't plan for future things. We're in an age of cutting. House and Senate have come back and said, no, NASA, you need to start planning because we want to continue to lead the world. And that's been a very powerful message that we've used on Capitol Hill that has been used by members of both parties as a key reason for supporting NASA, and specifically science is the fact that it is global competition and preeminence that is of great concern to the Congress. So this annual budgeting process, this is kind of what it's supposed to look like. Actually, by law, what it's supposed to look like. This is not how it happens, right? This is this nominal case where you have a budget passed by September 30th. Last time that has happened was fiscal year 1997, which was decided in calendar year 1996. So it's been nearly 30 years since the last time this regular order, as you'll hear it called, has gone through for all 12 appropriations packages that Congress has to pass. What the real budgeting process looks like is more like this, right? You have the beginning of it pretty similar. But you eventually get to the point where there is not consensus on the budget by the end of the fiscal year. And so you kick the can down the road with a continuing resolution, sometimes multiple, that gives Congress more time to deliberate on what ultimately becomes what we call an omnibus bill, which is just an amalgamation of all of those 12 bills into one, or sometimes mini buses, which is groups of those bills all wrapped up into small packages that the Congress then passes to fully fund the government for the remainder of the fiscal year. A continuing resolution is not necessarily a bad thing because you can't cancel programs or projects under a continuing resolution by law. However, you can't start new projects. So if you're at a very critical moment for something like NASA, which deals in projects on timescales of 5, 10, 20 years in some cases, it might be critical to make a launch window or something that you start a project in a given fiscal year. And so that's some of the problems that a CR might pose. But largely, keeping the government open and operating is a good thing. We like that. We are basically at this point, actually I should update this slide. So we're to the floor vote over here in the House of Representatives. Basically both the House and Senate have passed their budgets out of committee.
Jack, why don't we stop right at this
Yeah.
point and take some questions about the House and Senate bills that I
That
see
would
coming in.
be
That might be a good time to do that. So I'll start with one here. Did Senate comment on MSR? Either way.
The Senate did not comment on MSR, but does fund the Planetary Science Division at a level that you could fit MSR into that top line.
So
So
not
I'll say.
exactly a strong endorsement, if at all.
But I will say the Senate did propose cancellation of MSR just a year ago. And so the fact that it is allows for that space within the Planetary Science Division, the top line doesn't decrease by that significant amount, and it doesn't call it out as a program for cancellation. I think that is a welcome improvement for the flagship Mars sample return program.
Someone was asking, why didn't we see Viper anywhere? And that's actually a good question.
It's a really good question. There are 120 flight projects across all of the divisions. It's a matter of, I think, bandwidth. Believe me, we were talking about Viper all year, as well as the many other projects that are of importance to us. I am concerned that Viper's not included because there's a big policy question about, well, is it going, like, we don't have a path forward. The thing's built sitting in a clean room. It's ready to go. The longer we wait, the worse it could fare in those conditions. And so the fact that it's not included is something of concern, but it is not canceled. Meanwhile, there is no clear path forward.
I mean, I think part of it may just be that there's no clear, technically, and similar with MSR, like there's not a clear technical path forward, given the issues that both for landing Viper and then also for figuring out an architecture for MSR that has a high degree of probability of fitting within some feasible cost window. Both of those are pretty challenging if you don't have the cooperation of the executive branch directing NASA to basically find a path for those, right? There's only so much you can do through legislation and appropriations on those. But a good question. I mean, that's a great issue to kind of keep following on with Viper, I think. Ari, do you see any other questions kind of specifically about House and Senate?
There are some clarifying questions. One thing that might be worth circling back on is what's the difference between appropriations and authorization, just to get everyone on the same page. Yeah,
so we can keep throwing out it. We're talking a lot about appropriation here, the authorizing the treasury, unironically authorizing the treasury to provide money to agencies for obligating funds. The authorization is more of an oversight and policy set of directives. Originally, and I mean, I guess technically it still is, it authorizes kind of ceilings that appropriators can then work up to. That it rarely works in that case anymore, except for maybe the NDAA, the National Defense Spending Bill or Authorization Bill. NASA used to have an annual authorization that functionally ended in the mid-90s, and since then I think has had 6. And so they're trying to push new authorizations. Can still be very powerful. Authorization in 2010 is why we have the Space Launch System and Orion crew capsules now. We have, they can set directions and policies, and there's a pretty solid authorization working its way through the Senate that has some very strong language for balanced science, Mars sample return, habitable worlds, and other major science missions that I think is generally very positive. And so that's another avenue about if Congress can pass an authorization that directs the pursuit of these projects, then it's not just there's a larger issue in terms of it makes it more difficult to just flat out cancel it by defunding them.
So I've also seen several questions that are now forward looking about the House and Senate. What are the opportunities for supplementals in fiscal year 26? And maybe you can explain what that means, or in other terms, anomaly in the continuing resulution.
Let's get to the CR section and talk about CR stuff, just because that'll take some background too. Yep. But any kind of specific differences, House and Senate, Jack, do you see any other questions we should address?
I saw one about the sounding rocket program, funded out of heliophysics. Not entirely sure if that one is specifically called out. I do know the balloon program, which is over in astrophysics, is funded, which was slated for cancellation.
So Chandra was funded in the House, called out in the House. That was nice to see.
Chandra's funded. So yeah, there are some smaller projects or program areas that aren't like one mission, but are like a series of things like the balloon and sounding rocket program that are called out.
I think that maybe the simplest way to think of this is that the Senate proposal is the closest to status quo, and the House proposal, while still is far better than the White House request, has a bigger shift. It still cuts quite a bit of science and kind of moves more things around. But again, both would provide for space grant and EPSCoR funding to continue various parts of NASA's education system. Both would move, I believe, the commercial lunar payload delivery services into human spaceflight initiatives rather than science. So there's a lot of overlap. But again, I think the Senate is kind of the from the ideal case of status quo, that's the closest to where we were in terms of program. Someone's asking, any project would move into Space Force? None that I'm aware of. Though Space Force now officially does have a larger budget than NASA, even before these proposed cuts.
That was like I think 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, that happened real fast.
When they eclipsed
as expected,
NASA.
yes. How does budgeting trajectory compare to other nations? There's not as much. I guess we can really compare to ESA and a few others. It's worse, I'd say. I don't think there's any nation that's really. A lot of them are seeing some struggle. I mean, Canada's having some budgetary struggles. ESA's growing. China, we think, is growing based on investments and actions, but it's not as clear how money is spent. And India is growing. And so I'd say NASA is definitely an outlier, particularly for having advanced capabilities in space, as proposing to undermine a lot of its own investments, certainly in science. Yep. I don't think there's any other nation that's tuning down its science program right now.
Yep.
A similar question I've been seeing is, how do NASA's cuts compare to cuts of other agencies that have been proposed?
NASA's science cuts were very much in line with other science agency cuts. Right. And so on the order of a half, right, is kind of your average proposed cut. And that's what NASA overall, I guess I couldn't pull up the top of my head the overall agency comparisons. I mean, it's still a quarter. I don't know what that puts. I think it's probably in the middle of the pack. Okay, it's not zero like some things were. And then obviously it's going to be, kind of preferred actions like Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, and others see growth and investment, if not flat. So yes, it was House was a roughly 18% cut to NASA science. Senate was basically flat for NASA science. Both kept the same basic top line for NASA. I'm looking at questions as they're coming in.
Yep.
Someone's asking, like, is this a good, has anyone looked at, can you, like, why we should be saving these missions? I think the key here is that every NASA science mission that's marked for termination here has passed or is about to pass an independent review panel that asserts its ongoing validity and value in returning science. So it's not an issue that they're not valuable and they're not returning useful science. And that's what's, in a sense, marks a significant change. Ari, do you see any other key questions here that we should address at this point?
I see a lot of questions that it sounds like you guys are going to address in the coming slides.
Okay, it sounds like we should get to the CR section.
Let's talk our favorite.
Let's talk about the future.
So we can actually, one thing I did want to point out. So I do have a rough estimation of, based on the folks that have left agency as part of the deferred resignation program. Now, this is just DRP. This is not any of the like normal attrition, retirements, or any of the other voluntary resignation programs. So this is again still just an estimation of where those DRPs have affected all of the field centers. And so it's not uniform, but you look at places like Goddard, which I think has been disproportionately affected by the DRP, as well as things like Langley, which is, it seems like most places are experiencing about half of the expected layoffs have come through the DRP, which was the sort of intent, right, of the DRP, was to sort of voluntarily let people lay themselves off, which is about 4,000 people, just under 4,000 people for the DRP program, I think is the number. Casey, did you say you had some slides on the CR?
We have some slides in the CR, I think.
Yeah. Well, I guess, yeah, I can just throw this in here about just the reductions in force, just something I want to flag Scott Kapoor, the director of the Office of Personnel Management, went on a WTOP, one of the local radio stations here in the DC area, basically saying there is no plan to do any additional reductions in force after the quote unquote success of the DRP program. And so that basically puts us at a place where across the federal government, 300,000 people will have left by the end of this year, 4,000 of those at NASA. There is another issue we're tracking related to the recent executive order that marks NASA as a national security agency, which then rescinds labor protections for the remaining civil servant workforce, who are represented by one of the two labor unions that represent NASA.
There's a quick question, Jack, regarding workforce. People are asking about JPL. We don't have as much insight. JPL is not a NASA center. It is a federally funded research and development center managed by Caltech for NASA. And so it reports things differently. And we don't have, as far as we, I know that they've had reductions and people are leaving. But I have not seen the same type of reporting of those numbers yet.
They were not eligible for the DRP, is my understanding, because they are not civil servants. They are employees of Caltech. However, I do know that a significant number have left voluntarily. Plus, you have the situation regarding the fires, the Eaton fire in Los Angeles,
and some layoffs after MSR was really ramped down last year.
Yeah, there's all that too. So JPL was hit hard over the last 2 years anyway, and so is already has been reeling from recent budget cuts to the agency, or budget stagnation, we'll call it. So yeah, let's talk continuing resolution. Casey, you want to take this?
Yeah. So we're at a turning. I'd say, I've said this before. If we were in any other year, and any other director of the OMB, Jack and I would be popping corks of champagne and spraying each other with it, because I think, in a sense, Congress has done its job to a large extent, and from here on out, it would just normally be an inevitability. It would be just a matter of time before we would see these proposed cancellations rejected, and we would restart this process, with a understanding that the White House wouldn't bother to do this again because it's just going to be rejected again. However, unfortunately, this is not any other year, and we have kept our champagne bottles corked because we're coming up to what's called a continuing resolution. So fiscal year 2026 begins, as Jack said, in less than 3 weeks. We are in a situation where it is almost certain that there will not be full year appropriations ready to go. As Jack said, has not happened for 30 years, not a surprise. A continuing resolution is basically, you say, it's like you take an Excel tab and just stretch it to the right? It's supposed to just extend current funding from 1 year, through some, annualized amount into the next year while we wait for Congress to provide appropriations. So it's meant to be a stopgap holding pattern. Intention, the broader intent is that in a CR, you're not starting big new projects. You're not ending projects either, right? There's been no formal approval one way or another by Congress based on whatever the proposals are. At the same time, there's a thing called the Anti-Deficiency Act, which says that the US government is not allowed legally to contractually obligate money that it does not have explicit authorization for, right? So there's always a potential. If you're in a continuing resolution, you're extending money, you don't know if your program is going to go up or down at the end of the year. If you spend, you're walking maybe along the side of a cliff or walking off of a plank, and suddenly maybe the budget passes and you have a lot less than you planned for. Then you've overspent what you were allowed to spend, and you're in violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. So you have to take any budgeting office director in the past would have to take a conservative approach of spending money during a continuing resolution. Now, normally, that's not a huge deal if the continuing resolution is a couple of weeks, even a couple of months. But it can be more challenging and certainly much more uncertain when the discrepancies that we're talking about are as dramatic as they are, right? So we have a situation where NASA's Science Mission Directorate either has $7.3 billion, $6 billion, or $3.9 billion next year, right? According to the range of options that are being put out there. That is a dramatic range. Add to that the OMB director taking let's say, a very aggressive view of executive authority in terms of spending, who has said that congressional appropriations, even themselves, are a ceiling, not a floor for spending. And you have a potential situation where these dramatic cuts could potentially functionally be implied during a short-term stopgap period. Not because on paper, but they have the same amount of money, but because they are going to restrict, again, that flow of money. The rate of spending will drop, dramatically. It's like pinching a garden hose, right? And so during that period, there are a number of restrictions, that the OMB itself provides through these things called the A11 circular. I'm sure all of you have read it. It's a mere 900 pages, but it was just updated back a few weeks ago in August. And it is a directive from the Office of Managed Budget to the budgeting offices, CFOs at various federal agencies about what to do and how to prepare their budget, including directions on what to do during a CR. The overall gist is, again, the clear reading of it is that they're supposed to maintain or not take any actions that impinge upon congressional intent, with congressional intent kind of being roughly applied as anything that's been passed out of committee, right? That seems, it's been gone through a certain amount of process. But, and that's a big but, we just do not have certainty right now, right? We have a situation where, we have like a mission like Juno is projected by the White House to have $0 next year. Congress has explicitly called out for funding it. It is that discrepancy is going to provide a potential where even if there is an apportioned amount of money that could continue funding for it, there may be a restriction of obligations. They may not be able to allow drawdowns on that account to pay their staff, to pay for operations, to pay for whatever. I'm not saying it will happen. There's been actually very little clarity from the administration, unfortunately, on this. What has been said over and over again, and I guess, Jack, you can say it's shifted over time in a generally, I'd say, a positive direction, was initially they said the president's budget, we were planning for the president's budget October 1st. Now that can be read multiple ways, right? And I think part of it is just that's a way to say like that's what we're planning for, but if Congress says otherwise, we're not going to do it. That's shifted to say, I think we've heard more and more that it's like we're going to follow congressional intent during a CR. But again, it kind of depends on what they define as intent and what degree that means. Jack, do you want to jump in and add anything here, or we could look at some questions? I'd say that's the overall gist. It's not a very satisfying answer because, frankly, we just do not know. This is one of the reasons why Planetary Society today and 14 other organizations released a joint letter calling for specific directives in a continuing resolution forbidding any funds from being used to shut down missions, terminate missions. We've seen similar letters coming from members of Congress with the same concern. It's not saying it will happen, but it would certainly prevent that activity from happening. So it's a serious concern.
Yeah, indeed it is. I did see a question earlier, pretty early on, asking what do we think the chances are of an anomaly, which is what you would call a provision of a continuing resolution, doing just that, protecting existing missions. And I think it's really hard to estimate, given that the only data point we have is this supposed clean CR that came out just yesterday, basically funding the government until November 21st, but like no guardrails or stipulations, which has been a talking point of the Democratic caucus in both the House and Senate, that in order to earn their support, which Republicans very likely will need, especially in the Senate, where they need 60 votes to pass any stopgap funding measure, they're going to need Democrats to support it. And the stipulation they have is that they want to make sure there are guardrails on spending, not least of which includes NASA. So that already is, this clean CR is already facing an uphill battle. Plus there is members of the Republican conference on the House side who do not like continuing resolutions to begin with. And so it is a very difficult spot to be in a clean CR. The benefit of a more complicated CR is that you can provide things that incentivize fellow members of Congress to vote for something, right? Yeah. And so including, and so part of the, we'll say part of the strategy of these letters and these calls and letters that people have been sending is to show that there is significant public support organizational support, and congressional support for including such an anomaly. So I would say the chances are not zero, but it's very hard to say where on that spectrum they lie. But I will say this is, I think, maybe the first time in the history of Congress that such a request has been made of the Appropriations Committee for NASA. So I think that is a major step forward that this has such bipartisan and broad support.
And I think it reflects the degree of concern about this. And a lot of it, again, is going to come down to we have not seen outright impoundment, right? We have not seen outright, flagrantly defying statutes and laws. And I don't necessarily expect to see those. But through selective interpretations and certain types of decisions, we could theoretically see some pretty dramatic impacts, right? And so the guidance, again, and I want to just kind of revisit this. So the reason that the A11 circular is so important here is what it changes and what it doesn't. We have comparisons from the 2024 Biden A11 circular during a lead up to a CR. And we have one that just, again, came out a couple weeks ago, reflecting the new leadership of the OMB. And the directives for a CR do not change dramatically. And so we can read that on the literal sense and be encouraged by that. Again, the priority of do not impinge on the final directives of Congress by the decisions you make. Now, again, that's normally framed in a cutting action where Congress wants to cut more than the White House does. But there's also a variety of directions on you must maintain a minimal amount of activity to keep operating. And I think that's going to be the interpretation of that may just be a much harsher interpretation of what minimal means, right? So maybe you're not going to turn off a spacecraft, but maybe you do no science on it. Maybe you just do the minimal operations to keep it alive and healthy, but nothing can happen, no science planning. That could be a possibility, right? There's also the fact that it takes a while to turn off a spacecraft. There are situations where, just shutting it down or safe, kind of ultimately doing a shutdown process, termination process on spacecraft, multi-week, sometimes multi-month. That will take funding during an appropriate, during a continuing resolution. So there could be, even if nominally we hear that shutdown procedures have begun on certain missions, there may be a window of time to undo those right before those become permanent. So this is one of the reasons why we scheduled our upcoming day of action for right after the start of the fiscal year. So we could essentially be there on the ground if we start to hear of some overstepping on this area. Yeah. But again, I'll emphasize that the trending of information that we are hearing has generally been in the positive direction, but we need to verify that based on these other statements. So, to shut down these projects and missions dramatically right away during a short-term CR would be a violation of the OMB's own guidance to federal agencies, right? So that's, I think, the strongest piece of information we have to stand on right now.
It is. I just see a quick question. You just said members of Congress have called on the specific directive against ending these programs for NASA. Specific examples, and are the letters coming from both sides of the aisle? There are. So the Planetary Science Caucus, led by Representatives Chu and Bacon from California and Nebraska, respectively, submitted a letter to the Appropriations Committee, and I believe put out a press statement just yesterday, before the clean CR text dropped, basically saying this is a priority for us that these protections be included against, shutting down these programs. It was signed by 6 other members, including multiple Republicans. So it's coming from both sides of the aisle, representing multiple states, and so it's a very, again, showing that broad, I think, political unity that exists in the Congress to protect NASA's programs. And so this is also I'll say this, with the clean CR being out, or the first draft CR being out, it really is just that, a first draft, right? This is the opening salvo of what will be a very contentious 2 weeks as we careen towards that September 30th deadline for the fiscal year. And Congress is also out next week. for the Jewish holidays. So next week, Congress is not going to be in DC, so they have to finish up their work this week, and we'll have two legislative calendar days at the end of this month, the 29th and 30th, to pass any legislation to keep the government open. So I do want to get to...
Yeah, we'll take more questions, but let's kind of run through some potential scenarios here.
Yeah, I want to talk about our potential paths forward. So we have our, I'll say probably our like worst case broadly scenario, though again, as Casey's saying, the tenor of what we're hearing from OMB and from NASA leadership has shifted quite dramatically over the past 2 months, where it used to be the PBR is inevitable. You should plan for these cuts. We're going to lay people off. Contracts are going to be canceled, to now being, well, we're going to follow congressional intent through the A11 circular, as well as public statements that Secretary Duffy, acting NASA administrator, has said that they're going to be, they will move forward with congressionally supported programs. So this first path, this clean CR, is basically send something out that has no guardrails. Maybe OMB will go back on its word and start to impose those PBR cuts. And that is probably our worst case scenario, right? That's the thing that we've been worrying about for months, but this is kind of an old expectation, right? Because of all those changes that Casey was talking about. And the recourse would be limited, but not completely absent. Congress ultimately does have power of the purse and would be able to enact a full year budget. And the good news is that, shutting down missions is not an instantaneous process. So there would be a lot of pain that would happen. I don't want to discredit or discount that. A lot of pain would happen in those first few weeks to months under a continuing resolution. But the last day, the irreversible things like shutting off missions would not happen necessarily overnight, has come to our understanding. And so Congress would still be able to act. So this is we'll call it that worst case scenario. Path 2. We get a full year continuing resolution like we're currently in. In order to get a full year continuing resolution, something that the appropriators really don't want to do, they don't like giving up their power like they have in this current year for fiscal year 2025. There would have to add in items that would build consensus across party divisions, ideological divisions within the parties, to make sure that they had the votes to pass a full year continuing resolution. So this would not be that clean, very cut and dry 90-page CR. This would be something maybe in the 400, 500 pages of legislative text, right, that would provide those guardrails to make sure that programs stay funded, and not just at NASA, but across the federal government. And this is why the advocacy we've been doing last week and this week, and I mean, really for the past 6 months, but really kind of culminating in the month of September, has been vitally important, is to highlight the need for this and building that political support in Congress, so that when they go to write a full year CR, whether that's next month or 3 months from now, that case is being made and continued to be made as this becomes a more substantial path forward. I will say full year CR. I know Speaker Mike Johnson has floated the idea. Majority Leader Thune has floated the idea in the Senate, to a lot of, we'll say, consternation from House and Senate Republicans, who I don't think, who control the majority and don't want to give up this sort of initial opportunity to pass a budget with control of the White House for other priorities outside of that of NASA. Let's say if a full year CR is passed that doesn't have guardrails, I don't know how that gets passed based on the math that I'm tracking, but say they do, a clean full year CR would have the same challenges as Path 1, but the likelihood of it not having those guardrails, or at least some additional legislative text associated with it, is pretty low. And then the final possible path forward is the omnibus, right? Or potentially multiple minibuses. Basically, Congress gets tired of a continuing resolution after continuing resolution. They're like, let's pass something. We need to get it all done before insert funding deadline here. And we are going to do everything in our power to build that bipartisan coalition needed to pass it out of both chambers of Congress. Likely, an omnibus will take the form, at least as it relates to the NASA budget, will use those proposals that are currently being considered by the House and Senate as the foundation on which they build a bipartisan consensus around an omnibus funding bill or multiple minibus funding bill. Oftentimes, these are called Christmas tree bills because everyone gets to hang a little ornament on them. And they also typically happen sometime around December. Though the last 2 years, this has happened in March. So I guess Christmas in March for those in Congress. But this allows the various factions across the government or across Congress to put in all of the stipulations, guardrails, considerations that they possibly could want to get them to vote yes on this. These are very large bills. Largely, the Appropriations Committee members rail against omnibuses, I think for good reason. They want to do regular order. They want to go through the traditional process. But that hasn't happened in nearly 30 years. And so I am an advocate, I think, for regular order. I think as any good policy wonk might be. But the reality is that a likely omnibus bill is going to have to come as a sort of consensus operation for the Congress. And so that will allow things like the full funding of NASA and the no less than language from the House and the funding levels for the science divisions in the Senate to kind of all mix together into a final spending package that actually results in a stronger NASA that has clear stability and direction provided by the Congress. And so those are our three. Here are some key takeaways. And I guess while we have this up, Casey, do you have anything you want to add, or we can just kind of shift over to questions?
Yeah, let's keep taking questions at this point. I think this slide kind of speaks for itself.
Yeah.
I'm just seeing a few more just about government shutdown. Is it likely? Yes, it is. Well, define likely. It's a very high possibility for sure. We flirted with one 6 months ago, and it's certainly a lot of issues getting Democratic votes in the Senate to make this pass. So it certainly isn't unlikely. Yes, that's not too much of a hedge. It's a realistic possibility. If it does happen, I would guess that it would not last super long, but it's certainly a possibility. Other questions here kind of about, just to clarify in the CR, would it be funded at president's level, House level, or Senate level? The OMB puts out this is a simple calculation of basically an annualized rate of spending equivalent to the prior year. But it's going to be, even though they'll have that available on paper to spend, they'll be taking a very, very high amount of scrutiny to making new obligations, contract obligations and payouts in order to slow that down. So it's probably closer to the president's budget request in practice, even though the money will be technically there on paper. And it'll be, there's going to be some push and pull. And hopefully, I think a lot of back channel communication with some of the key members of the Appropriations Committee that can hopefully keep that from being too draconian in terms of impact. And again, another key thing here to remember is that the apportionments are made on the Treasury account level. That means like NASA science, right? It's not the Juno mission funding. And so there's a chunk of money for NASA science, but again, they got to pay for all the other things in that. It's not just keeping these missions going, right? So it's, missions in development, it's workforce, it's infrastructure, research payouts and grants that they've made, all those types of commitments as well. And so they may have a chunk of money with no specific direction to shut down a project. But they'll just, at some point, the math is going to catch up with them if this goes on for a long time. Ari, are you seeing any other notable questions here that we should, or Jack?
I did see one here. What are the chances of an omnibus happening without a CR? I'd say that very specific omnibus without CR, I'd say near impossible. That would functionally mean in the next week and a half, they'd have to come to an omnibus deal. Typically not how it's going to play out. It's going to be that CR first, whether that's 1, 2, maybe more CRs, right? Depending on what the increments are. And the one the House proposed just yesterday that does have a lot of pushback from Senate Republicans and Democrats, as well as House Republicans and Democrats, is until November 21st. And then you'd have to either pass an omnibus or the regular spending bills or do another CR. As it's typically happened, it'll be after 1 or 2 CRs that you'll eventually get to well, we need to pass an omnibus just to get this done, all done in one vote as opposed to 12 separate votes, which for those who care about parliamentary procedure is a very difficult feat in both the House and Senate in particular. So an omnibus expedites the process, though it is, sort of against that tradition of regular order. I don't know if you can call it a tradition anymore since we haven't done it in 30 years, but the hope for regular order.
We all have nostalgia for
1996
regular order from I see questions here about debt limit. That's not an issue right now. I forget if it's suspended or raised high enough. It's not going to be an issue for a while, going back to earlier this year.
So I've seen a few about what are the implications of another flat CR for NASA programs.
Like a full year CR, I would imagine.
Yeah.
I mean, putting aside, I'd say, bureaucratic chicanery that could happen. There's still going to be the issues of inflation, workforce, just cost of doing things, right? And so it would still be a functional cut, obviously way better than it's a cut that you can adapt to much better, right? Than having losing half of your funding. Marcia, that's a good one. If NASA ends up funded at basically its current level, will it have the workforce needed to execute those missions? I guess we're about to find out, aren't we? I mean, I think also, I mean, Jack showed some of those numbers. We don't exactly know. They haven't really reported, to my knowledge, exactly what capabilities and areas they've lost. We saw some leaked numbers from Politico a few months back saying that most of the departures were in the technical and skilled areas and not the administrative staff, correct? Right? And ironically, I think, Jack, that you showed NASA headquarters not losing people at all. It's kind of the opposite of, I think I brought this up once, what's the goal here? Because at the end of the day, they seem to have just lost a bunch of technically skilled people and retained their management and administrative employment that they said they had too much of, well, from the top level, right? I honestly do not know. I certainly hope we do, but they've lost a lot of great talent.
So to follow up on that, what is your guys' opinion on how hard it'll be to restart projects and rehire experts if at some point later on we do receive the funding that we're asking for, but there's a delay?
Go ahead, Jack.
I was just going to say, I mean, it depends on when that happens, right? It would be a lot easier to rehire people that have left sooner. You'd also have to require that the freeze on federal hiring is lifted. There's a number of just administrative things that would have to happen, right, to bring people back, especially because the path that they went down for the layoffs, it isn't so much layoffs in the traditional sense, but rather voluntary departures. And so with those voluntary departures, these are people who said, okay, I've had enough. I'm done, and left, right? And they got a very generous benefits package, which, just so you know, we're still paying people through, I think, the middle of January. And so the supposed savings from the sort of coerced layoff, right, that we've experienced across the federal government, the savings we won't even see until the middle of fiscal year 2026. And I even don't really even want to call them savings, because that is a lot of expertise lost. I mean, even if it's just for those 4,000 people, if it's 10 years of average experience, which I think that's a very low bar. That's 40,000 years of collective experience that we're losing, right, in doing these quite literally near impossible tasks. So
There's a question, is there any chance the PBR ultimately succeeding if the
Very low.
president puts a lot of attention towards pushing that through Congress?
I would say very low in the sense of enacting the PBR through a regular appropriations process. As we've seen, the administration has more or less all but backed off of even referring to their budget request in public statements. It's been long enough, and the pushback has been severe enough from the Congress that they know it's deeply unpopular.
Yeah.
Now, their only recourse, right, is this thing that we're worrying about October 1st. If there's no clear guardrails, is OMB going to, go down these processes of impounding funds to functionally get to the PBR level? But that is, again, based on the rhetoric we're seeing, based on the policy decisions that are happening, that the administration is actively doing, looking thinner and thinner, chance-wise, as the days go by.
I'd say the bigger likelihood is that there's going to be a stochastic level of attention paid to certain things that are either politically more viable or easier to get through the Republican caucus. And I think we can kind of look to what the actual rescission process that we did see earlier in the year with public radio and public television, Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and then international aid, where that was seen as an opportunity, right? But it was, and the scale of spending, it was $8 billion, right, out of this trillions that we mentioned earlier. So I would expect to see that. I don't think NASA hits that kind of level of attention NASA activities do, which is good for us in that sense. But I think I agree with Jack. I think writ large, this was definitely a statement thing. But I think that a very consistent thing we've seen with this administration is pushing the boundaries, and then if we get told to go back, great, we'll go, we'll pull back. But if we don't, then hey, gravy. Or we get some of the thing, then they're just kind of pushing the capabilities of executive authority and pushing that Overton window as far as they can, and taking what they can get out of it. So this could be an expression of that.
I'll just add to that. We don't know where their goal line is, right?
Yeah.
We don't know where the administration really wants to end up. This is the administration, as we've seen in other areas of policy. It's all about expectations and perception. It's not about actually putting out, here's earnestly what I want the policy to be, right? It is going in one direction or another on it to get to some middle ground, which I will say is not like a totally new thing to politics, right? Compromise is sort of has been the name of the game in the past, where you have two very strongly competing sides, and you end up at sort of a middle ground that maybe you're both happy with or both equally annoyed with. But we don't know where their line in the sand is, right? Whether it comes to the federal workforce or budget levels. It could be very close to currently enacted. It could be closer to the PBR level. We don't know that until something gets passed. And then I guess we have to look at their appetite for pushing that ability of the executive branch to impose its will without the advice and consent of Congress, which is a whole other ball of wax, right?
Yeah.
As we're talking
Starts
about.
to go above our space policy page.
Right. Right.
Question saying that missions on the chopping block are getting money in monthly increments. Will that continue, or what will happen after October 1st? I guess I honestly don't know. I would assume similar. Again, looking at their own directives, right, is all we kind of have right now. And they're supposed to continue that maybe with minimal operations. So again, the definition of minimal is going to be the key thing here. And we're, I guess, going to soon figure that out. But again, I think we've seen, to kind of build on something Jack said earlier too, pushback has worked in various areas, right? And so we're working with a bipartisan coalition of people who are publicly, but also privately, pushing back in a lot of areas to try to get through this. And I'd say having a slightly more empowered, even though he's acting administrator, is helpful rather than nobody functionally at all. I think that an underlying story to all of this, right, is that NASA has had no empowered leadership functionally for this entire time. And this budget that came out had functionally no NASA input. They were given numbers and told to fit things into them. And the people who fit things into them were primarily the political appointees. Most of the skilled staff at NASA and program managers found out about what their budgets were roughly the same time we did when it was published, and then had to figure out what was going to be in those, right? So this is not, again, this is not the product, and the chaos, the uncertainty is a product of the again, this kind of somewhat chaotic policymaking process where there isn't really a structured policymaking process for space, for civil space, beyond kind of the broader focus on saying humans to Mars. But beyond that, it's kind of who can grab and who can assert their influence within that power vacuum. Take a few more questions here. We're beyond 90 minutes, but there's still a decent amount of folks on the line, so happy to answer some more questions about this crazy topic.
So one thing that might be worth clarifying, I've seen a lot of questions about this, is what is the difference between the budget situation for manned missions versus NASA science?
Well, in general, the human exploration side financially does a lot better. And we've seen a lot more attention coming from that, as we saw from the Republican caucus and the big beautiful bill. And then also just from the House budget itself would move effectively $2 billion towards exploration, human exploration projects. And so I'd say Congress likes it even more than the White House. The White House increased the budget for human spaceflight activities, but also proposed to cut functionally all scientific activity off the International Space Station, reduce crew rotations, cancel. I mean, that's a debatably. I know this. A lot of people like this, but to cancel SLS and Orion, and shift to commercial providers. So there's in terms of interest, there's a general alignment for humans in space. And I think the interesting division has been adding this Mars pivot that is being, I think, again, like actively undermining this broader Artemis consensus of the moon first approach that has been wildly successful as these things go, politically speaking. And it's threatening to kind of undo some of that longer term investment, I think, at Artemis. So we're seeing a very strong response to that at the political level. So overall, they're doing a lot better, but still, I mean, there's huge uncertainty. Lunar Gateway proposed to be canceled right away, right? October 1st. Big Beautiful Bill gives it $750 million, right, next year. So there's money for it. But I think exactly how that's going to be pursued and spent is the frustration that we're seeing expressed by members of Congress who supported that. So there's still quite a bit of uncertainty around that, though just not to the same degree that we're seeing in science.
If I can take a point of personal privilege to plug the Day of Action.
Someone asked how many people we have signed up for that.
I would be happy to report a general number. Obviously, we're still a couple weeks out. I don't want to say that it's going to be a specific number and then it just falls short, right? Obviously. So just generally speaking, our Day of Action typically ranges between 80 and 100 people, right? We had 106 people earlier this year, largest one we've ever done in person. The ones we did virtually had about 120-ish people involved. We surpassed 200 registrations like 2 weeks ago. So, and we have not slowed down. I have plenty of emails from our schedulers trying to make sure everyone gets placed in the right congressional districts and everything that I have to sort through tonight. But this is the most successful, at least registration period we've ever had for the Day of Action. And I think in large part because the severity of the situation calls for it. And we're going to be there, as Casey said, on the first session day of October, the day when everybody comes back from meeting with constituents after the end of the fiscal year. We are going to be the first ones to respond to whatever is happening on that day. And best case scenario, right? I saw a question about strategy. Our best case scenario, we're kind of working out all of these different plans, right? So that we can execute as soon as we know which path we're going down. The ideal situation is we are there reinforcing what Congress has already put out, which is strong support for NASA, strong support for science, and making sure that in the negotiations for any omnibus or minibus bill, any budget deal, that NASA is well represented and that our support is made clear. If we have to be responding to serious situation related to impoundment and the continuing resolution, we're going to be ready for that too. And so our strategy is at this point sort of still in a little bit a state of flux, but by and large, this is a day to save NASA science, right? That's why we branded it that way. And I don't want to forget, National Science Foundation is also of key importance to us. Does see a big cut in the president's budget request, more than 50%, which would hurt a lot of researchers, a lot of students, the future workforce, plus installations like the Green Bank Observatory, and just the recently opened Vera Rubin Observatory down in Chile, right, run by National Science Foundation. We can't lose these incredible assets that we have, and so making sure that space science and exploration are fully supported in whatever budget deal comes down the pike later this year.
A few people are just asking about, is there a way to privately fill some of these science operations? It's very, very, very difficult to do that, mainly the degree of expense, even for cheap missions like Odyssey or $10 million a year. There's complexity in terms of moving an asset, public asset into a private ownership. It's happened. I think Caltech once took over a space telescope, and I'm blanking on the top of my head for that. There's been a few limited instances of it. I'd say notably though, there's no way, it's functionally impossible to backfill all of these, and it's very hard to get continued ongoing pursuit of these activities. It's like why we have a public space agency is to do these things that the private sector, either through charity or kind of commerce, cannot do. And I'd say it's actually, there's an irony to this, right? In that human spaceflight is actually something at least individuals and some in the commercial sector are willing to pony up for, right? We have people themselves putting lots of money towards private development of rockets and human space capable spacecraft or spaceflight missions, developing the infrastructure, particularly to enable human spaceflight to Mars. That's what NASA is proposing in this budget. The White House is proposing in this budget to invest in and double down in addition to, stuff that's already being pursued by the private sector, and then abandon the things that same private sector has shown no inclination to do. So, number of people have flown themselves into space and built rockets into space, but no individual has paid for a space science mission. Yeah, right. So there's a unique public role for a public space agency here to make sure these missions go. And there's a long history of basically struggles in the United States before World War II to establish some sort of public investment in scientific capability that shifted after that period. That now I think we're in a sense on shakier ground compared to that era. But yeah, there's a reason in a sense why NASA does this and no one else. Any other final questions here? I really thank you all for coming, by the way, and sticking through us an hour and a half of budget talk.
Hey, Jack. So when's the last day to sign up for the Day of Action? And for those who can't make it, what is something that they can do to help ensure that we continue funding NASA programs?
So the last day to register for the Save NASA Science Day of Action is a very convenient date, September 30th, the end of the fiscal year. That is the last day that registration will be open. Obviously, plane tickets, hotels, a lot cheaper when you book further out. We're less than 3 weeks out from the Day of Action. So the sooner you get registered, the better. Also helps our schedulers schedule those meetings. As you can imagine, 535 members of Congress trying to organize schedules for constituent visits. We want to be as flexible as possible to make sure that we get you into the meetings that matter most. Right. And that's meeting with your representatives, meeting with the folks that are ultimately making these decisions, right, about NASA's budget. What can you do from home if you are not able to make it for the Day of Action? There's actually a pledge form at planetary.org/Day of Action. I can drop that in the chat for everybody as well. And we'll follow up this webinar with an email with that information in there. There's a pledge form to say, I can't make it, but I want to be part of the activities that day. Like I said, strategy is still sort of in flux, so we haven't launched it yet, but we're going to have a letter writing campaign and phone calling campaign that are going to mirror the talking points and strategic goals that we have on the day of action so that you can be making the calls and sending the letters to support the work that's happening on the ground here in DC and amplify that message. It's been proven that when you combine all these activities, it increases your impact for congressional visit days like this. And so we're taking every opportunity to tap into the enthusiasm that we've seen over these past just 2 months of registrations. This is the quickest we've ever thrown together a day of action to make sure that we are making the biggest impact with our partners. And I will stress, this is not just the Planetary Society part of this. We have 17 other organizations that have joined us as partners in the Day of Action. This is truly a historic moment representing academia, professional societies, labor unions, technical and otherwise workforce groups, commercial space organizations, industry, like we just have everybody represented because science and NASA is so important to the future of the country, to workforce, to jobs, to economic development, to innovation, scientific discovery, all the great things, the reasons why we do this. That's why people have signed on. And so I'm thrilled to be a part of this coalition and really hope that you'll either make the time to come to DC or make the time to do your part from home on October the 6th.
Hear, hear. And yes, if someone asks a question, if you have submitted a message before and used the kind of the default template, and they want to do it again, you can modify all the default text. We just give that to you as a guide. Always great to add your own personal flourish to it, as long as it's polite and you reflect well upon the Planetary Society. It does make it stand out. They do have systems that kind of condense similar text.
Yeah.
Okay.
I see a question about the other organizations. There is an updated list on the planetary.org/day of action. I will, again, send that out in an email to everyone that registered for this event so that you have the most up-to-date information about that.
And I'm going to drop a link into for those who want to keep following this, if you don't already know of our Action Hub at the Save NASA Science Action Hub on planetary.org. Jack and I keep a running list of updates, updated talking points, updated FAQ, updated letters and references to help you all follow what's going on, because this is at times complex and somewhat opaque process, and we're trying to do our best to keep you all informed and understanding. Again, I'd say, just a takeaway, Jack, if you can go forward, I think maybe one more slide there. We are in a, this is, perfect. I mean, sometimes it sounds kind of still not great. There's a lot of bad things happening to NASA, but we are in a much better position than we were 6 months ago. Much, much better position, and better, frankly, than I necessarily expected. Congress is listening. Advocacy is working. We cannot let up. This should be encouraging us, right? That this is getting through. And so this is something that we need to not just, we can't just accept it, and we can't just, be depressed. It's okay to feel bad. But again, I think we're seeing a lot of promise, and that the worst thing that we can do is give up now, which is why we're doing the second day of action in a single year to really press this energy and press this advantage, and to really keep this. It's the challenge isn't so much that Congress agrees, it's keeping it as a priority for them. And that's what we have to keep pushing on. But we're in a much better position than we were earlier this year.
Yeah. Casey, I remember our meeting in, was that March? We threw out the playbook that we had for this year and had to basically start anew and just looking at what the possible outcomes were then and what were these 3 paths that we've described here. It's truly, I mean, just I don't want to say a 180, but it's at least been a significant turn in a positive direction for the future of NASA. Now we got to build back, right? We have to, this NASA's budget has been stagnant for years. We do have to, there's a lot of big questions. This is a moment in time, hopefully, that shows unity and cooperation across all of our partner organizations. but NASA needs strong direction, needs a good NASA authorization, needs solid leadership, right, with a Senate confirmed administrator. So it is vitally important that this is not just a moment, but that we build on the momentum of this Save NASA Science campaign and really support a strong NASA for the rest of this administration, into the next one, and forevermore into the future.
Well said. If you have more questions, feel free to shoot me or Jack an email. We'll do our best that we can to keep those responded to. Follow us on planetary.org, Save NASA Science, Space Advocate newsletter, Planetary Radio, or the Day of Action. Maybe we'll see you there. Jack, anything else to just mention here at the very end, besides thanking everybody, of course, for listening?
Seriously, thank you for taking the time to be part of this briefing. I hope we certainly did not get to every single question. They just were pouring in over the course of this. So I apologize if we didn't get to it. But I just dropped our email, advocacy@planetary.org, in the chat. If you want to send us a note, happy to take the time and sort of run you through what these paths are and what we're hearing and tracking and ways that you can help support. I also threw the Day of Action information in there. This truly is a phenomenal moment to come together, and really happy to be part of this team of three, right? Me, Casey, and Ari. And it's been a tough year. I do want to recognize that. There's been a lot of hurt, a lot of pain, a lot of uncertainty. But through sort of this solidarity that we've built over these many months with our partner organizations, allies in Congress, and even folks at NASA, we're going to get through this, and it's going to be because of that unity that happens. So please pat yourselves on the back if you've taken action. If you haven't taken action, planetary.org/action, and hope to see you on October the 6th.